Yeah, there we go. Perfect. Well, welcome everyone. Super excited to dive in again to this book and into this second part of this. And so we're going to deal with language comprehension this evening in the hour that we have together. And so for those who may not know, I'm Chad Williams. I'm a current grade 2-3 teacher. I'm from Saskatoon, and so I teach out in Prairie Spirit School Division. I'm also a lecturer at the University of Saskatchewan in the Curriculum Studies Department. And so there, if you're on Twitter, you can reach out. And then I kind of have two websites there. One is math and one is literacy that are kind of being built as I go. And so you might find that some things you click on and some stuff's there and sometimes not, but it's slowly developing into resources for teachers and for parents around math and literacy. So feel free to check those out as we go. I just want to look at the agenda here. I know Andrea touched on last week, but we'll just kind of again look at the simple view of reading and where language comprehension fits in. And we'll look at the Scarborough's rope, and that'll tie in with some of the things that we talk about today with language comprehension and the comprehension strategies. We'll talk about the vocabulary that was, part of this section. We'll give some time to connect with educators in breakout rooms and talk about the book and talk about what people are doing in the classrooms. And then we'll kind of get a glimpse into the classroom. And fortunate enough that we'll get a glimpse into my classroom. And so we'll talk about some things that I'm doing with vocabulary and with language comprehension a little bit later in the hour. And so let's review here the simple view of reading. And last week we kind of focused on the decoding part and looking at that. And now we move on to language comprehension and understanding that both of these things here lead into reading comprehension and understanding what we read. And so we'll dive into that and we'll break it apart. And obviously Scarborough's rope is with that. Sorry, I have the chat there off to the side, but I'll pop it back here a little bit later. And so I can also put the sites in the chat as well. So here we go with Scarborough's rope, and we're talking about the top part there with language comprehension. And again, as we look at some of these things, and if you're familiar, if you're from Saskatchewan and understand, a document that came out with Sask Reads, obviously there's some things in there that we can still piece together with the science of reading and other things that may have been more whole language and such. But when we think about some of this stuff, especially comprehension strategies, we'll see where this ties in to it. And so I know Andrea talked about it last time too. We got together. As that rope goes, all these skills that end up being kind of separate, taught separate, tend not to be separate as you go. And even when I think about it, as I move throughout a school year, as I start to do things individually with some of these skills, now as I'm into talking about it with reading with my students, that it's tied together so nicely that even as we talk about reading and comprehension and language comprehension, it's all fitting in together. And when you talk about one, you're already talking about another because they're so intertwined. And so even though you might start out spaced out with some of these things individually, those skills continue to wrap tighter and tighter together as we build or become skilled readers with this. And so I like one of the things too from the book that Chris says, it's talking about that language comprehension is not listening comprehension. And so sometimes we confuse the two, that, oh yeah, if we've got listening comprehension, we've got language comprehension, and that's not necessarily the case. We know that language comprehension is crucial in children's language capabilities, and language comprehension is more complex than that. And so we know that, there's things that we need to gain with the meaning from written text. And we know that the way we speak is different than the way we write, with looking at, a voice and looking at facial recognition and things like that as we listen to someone speak versus what we read on the page. And so we know, though, with it being so complex, that language comprehension includes that listening comprehension piece, which is why read alouds are still so important as you develop that language comprehension, bringing in that listening comprehension piece with it. And so I think, when we think back to looking at classes and looking at read alouds, that even though that students might be listening to what we're reading, again, too, they're going to build that vocabulary. They're going to build some of those things that we talk about in language comprehension, but that's not enough. It's just a little piece of it. And so how do they get in and start looking at the written word, which is obviously some of the skills that we want to build with as we look at language comprehension. And so if we think about comprehension, we think about that as that interaction between the reader and between the text that they're reading, and they're creating the meaning through these thought processes. And those thought processes are those skills that make up language comprehension. And sometimes we also look at some of those strategies that might come from the reading comprehension strategies that not necessarily aren't the skills, but are strategies that could be used, these tricks that could be used to gain understanding of what we're reading. But assuming that decoding is there, assuming that we have fluency in the decoding, that readers understand or need to understand that text structure. They need to understand the words, the phrases that they're reading, the syntax that's in those words and sentences, and then the context of what they're reading it in. Because again, we always know, or we've seen where someone reads a sentence or they're reading a passage, and what they're reading, they're not understanding the context that's in there. And obviously then the comprehension is not quite there because they're misinterpreting what they're reading. Yes, they might decode and they might be reading the words well, but they're not understanding necessarily what they're reading because they're not understanding some of these underlying skills in language comprehension. And so as we think about comprehension and think about the things that are in our head, we listen to the voices that are inside our head as we read. And so as we listen to these voices, as we think about these comprehension strategies that we might model, that we definitely explain, that we apply, and we hope our students apply as they read, but keeping in mind that that's a small part of it. That's a small part of building that language comprehension, of those skills in language comprehension. And so I want to put here to the side here on the left, again, those things under language comprehension, because when we think to it and we think, okay, as kids monitor meaning and they're listening to the voices, do I understand what I'm reading? They have to keep in mind all of these things. Do they understand what they're reading? Do they understand the vocabulary that they're reading? As they monitor the meaning, they have to understand the language structure and the syntax and the semantics of what they're reading, so that they truly understand what they just read on that page prior to moving on to a new page. And really, as they monitor, are they seeing a nonfiction book for the first time? Are they seeing something that they haven't seen before? The way to read a graphic novel, that literacy knowledge of the print concepts and of the different genres that they're going to read comes into play as they listen to the voices of, am I understanding what I'm reading? Am I understanding what I just read so I can continue to move on as I make meaning, and as these thought processes that I'm doing as I'm reading, and as we say, listening to the voice inside our head, which is why it's so important, as we model, as we have juicy and valuable mentor texts, as we do read alouds to kids as they listen, but then that gives us a chance to model and talk about some of these things. And then for students to then apply these things as they go out and read. But we know that as you look at monitoring meaning in a certain book, or looking at some of these other comprehension strategies, that they, you know, inferring in one book may not necessarily transfer for inferring into another, because some of the contexts are different. And so sometimes, you know, and I was one where it was like, hey, let's focus on, you know, a certain comprehension strategy for a month, and then we're going to get that, and they're going to get really good at that, and then we're going to move on. And so I've shifted my practices with as we model, and as I explain, and as I apply, that's still there, but that's not a huge focus of it, because it's just a strategy. It's a strategy to comprehend. And so now I've shifted to really concentrating on the language comprehension and how it then connects with this. And so if I think about, you know, activating background knowledge, that's right in there with looking at the vocabulary. Do I understand? Do I have the knowledge about what I'm going to read? And we all know, and we've had students where if I'm going to give them a reading assessment, I know if a student is going to do well at this because they have the background knowledge of what they're going to read, because they already know some of the vocabulary that's built into the book. And I know right away, as soon as I maybe put one down that, you know, that's been a book that I know they're not familiar with, that they're going to struggle a bit. Not that they can't read, and not that but the understanding's there because they don't understand the vocabulary, and they're not understanding potentially maybe that the way it was written. And so how do we build that background knowledge is obviously by building that vocabulary, by talking about things, and by learning about new things. And so that obviously will help us as we comprehend what we're reading. And so as I look at some of the others, and we look at making connections, and if we're making connections, that's looking at, you know, bringing in that vocabulary. What do I already know about something? Do I know something about another text? Have I seen another text use this structure? I've seen this genre. I'm going to connect it to this other genre as I make these connections. And so how does those connections transfer to help us build some of that language comprehension as we read? And so as we ask questions, as kids ask questions, they're continually wondering what's going to happen. That just builds into that monitoring meaning. That are they understanding what's being read? Do they want to know more? And let's read to find out. And so if they're asking questions, obviously they're paying attention to the vocabulary. They're paying attention to what's being written and what's being said. And so as we ask questions with it, we're staying open and being mindful of what we're reading, hopefully that we can find the answer. And if we can't, and we may have to infer, then what do we look at? What language structures are there? What verbal reasoning do we have to look at? You know, as students look at things, did the tree actually, you know, run, or is that something as a metaphor, or where does a simile pop in that you know brings out something that's happening in the book, but that's not actually true? And so those types of things all come into play with this in the comprehension strategies as kids comprehend what they're reading. And so that's really been a shift for me as I look at this stuff. Is my focus has shifted a bit elsewhere, but the comprehension strategies are there because those are important for reading comprehension. But I find that, you know, the language comprehension are those skills that I bring in so that we can do those comprehension strategies really well. And so for us as teachers, if we can model and we can explain and allow kids to apply that to what they're reading, you know, obviously then they're building on that language comprehension, listening to the voices in their head as they create meaning for what they're reading. And so we know that vocabulary is built through that reading and listening. And comprehension increases with obviously the more vocabulary knowledge we have. And I like this quote from Tim Rosinski, where he says there that, you know, there's no free pass when it comes to understanding words, and every unknown word means less understanding of a text. And we know that as kids read, if they're not understanding the words they're reading, obviously that's going to limit their comprehension as they go about what they're reading. And so this reminds me of a student I had today, and one of the things, you know, with it is as they come to a word that they don't know, can sound it out, can read it great, and, you know, turns and says, well, what does this mean? And so obviously this is one that's listening to their voice inside their head. They're monitoring their meaning. They come to a word, they could decode, they're just not understanding. And so again, a quick conversation that we can have and say, this is what this means. This is what it means in this context. Right? Now we can have this discussion about where does this word fit in other contexts. And obviously that's building that depth and that breadth of vocabulary that students need to become skilled readers and to be able to comprehend what they're reading. And so this book here, if you haven't had, I suggest you grab it and give it a good read. It talks about the vocabulary instruction in the book, Bringing Words to Life. And so the quote there, that vocabulary instruction, again, this is a shift that I had done, that it needs to be robust and vigorous. And so we need to explain meaning of what these words mean, and then also play around with it and interact with it in different ways. And I'm going to touch on a little bit of that, after we break out into rooms. And so I really think about, as students, as they become skilled readers, and building on those skills of the language comprehension of Scarborough's rope, and as it translates through into using some of the comprehension strategies, again, keeping in mind that time spent, and Chris mentions this too, time spent on the reading comprehension strategies is a small part, that it's not a long part anymore. That we're doing a set time, that we need to build the skills, and these are the strategies and the tricks to better comprehend. And so before we break out into rooms here too, I also want to get Andrea in here, because she's done some great work with some of the vocabulary work with Saskatoon Public, and doing some of the stuff with the Willow books, and so I'm going to show here, and I have a couple here. And so Andrea, feel free to pop in. I know this is your and so I have this, and I have one that's the Barnabas Project, and so I can show a quick thing about it. But go ahead and talk about this, how you kind of incorporated some of this stuff before we head into breakout rooms.
Yeah, sure, Chad. I'm happy to. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Willow books. And so it is a Saskatchewan thing, and I'll put the website in the chat for you to take a look at. But every year there is, I don't know if Anna is even on tonight, but there is a group of volunteers that look at, there's 3 different levels. So kind of a primary books, middle years books, and then older books, more appropriate for older students. But they look, and the criteria is that it has to be written by Canadian authors. And so these are all Canadian texts, and every year they choose 10 texts. And so here in Saskatchewan, and with Saskatoon Public, and I'm not sure if this happens across the province, but in our school division, the teacher librarians would purchase these books every single year. And so when we were thinking about how we can support teachers in more explicit phonological instruction and more explicit vocabulary instruction, we thought, well, here are books that we know are in all of our schools' libraries. And so definitely, oh, perfect. In Ontario, you have Blue Spruce. Oh, and Forest of Reading. Oh, good. Okay, that's awesome. So what we did was we created phonological activities, and you can see, and here actually we also tied it to some math concepts. But essentially we thought if you had a week's worth of lessons for each book. And so the week's worth of lessons includes some phonological activities for you to do as students every day. And we also pulled out some of that tier 2 vocabulary from each book. And based on Isabel Beck's from bringing words to life based on her instructional routine for vocabulary. We then built in how you could explicitly teach those words to students every single day for that entire week. And so we'll make sure that these, you may not have all of these books, but you might have some of them, or you might even think that you could, if you have something familiar, similar in Ontario, you may use our, how we kind of structured this, the template to build some of that. And we just thought, and I don't know, and I'm sure you'll talk about this in your breakout spaces, but we really felt that vocabulary instruction was something that teachers did more incidentally and not really explicitly. And we wanted to help them with that by creating some of these activities to go with some really good, juicy words.
Perfect, thank you. And I think I just noticed that when I was pulling something out, I probably just pulled the math portion out and didn't show the others. But I know that you're going to potentially share with this document and such. So
yeah, I'll send them to Alicia, and then when she sends out the recording, we'll make sure that you get this attached, these documents, and then you can feel free to use and adapt and, think about how you might want to, even if you just pull out the vocabulary activities, if you're interested in doing some of that.
Perfect. And so I'll skip over the math one and have a look if it's in there too. And so one of the things too that we're going to do is head into breakout rooms here right away. And I know that this section here was a large chunk, but I also know that there's a lot of great people here, and we can learn a lot from people that are here tonight. And so, as we break up into our breakout rooms, just think about, is there anything that stands out in this section in this book? And I already alluded to some of the stuff and how I shifted some of my practices and things that stood out. But then also, what are some things, what are some things that you're doing around language comprehension? What are the good things that you're doing? What are the things that you've shifted? What are the things that you've tweaked in order to potentially, like Andrea said, really be explicit or really focus on that vocabulary instruction with that? And so again, even though I might share, of this student today, that's incidental, that comes to me and says, hey, what's this word mean? That's great. But then, we also need something else with it. And I'll talk about, that after the breakout rooms. But, can you share a little bit in the breakout rooms about some of the things that you're doing? And so I think, looking at it here, give Andrea some time, and she put the guiding questions into the chat. I'm going to give it some time as Andrea kind of splits us into breakout rooms. And I know sometimes too, when you get into breakout rooms and time gets cut off and you're deep in conversation, is always tough. But we'll put into breakout rooms and we'll give a chat with colleagues from around. And so there we go. Andrea has put it in, inviting you to join a room, pop into a room and discuss those guiding questions, and kind of be about 10 minutes or so. Right. Wait as people come back. And Andrea, if you just let me know that all are back, then I can continue on. Looks like it.
Yeah, I think we're good to go, Chad.
All right, perfect. All right, so now I'm sure some great discussions in the rooms and sharing some stuff, and so I'm fortunate that I'll kind of share a little bit about what I do in my grade 2-3 class. And again, I kind of alluded to earlier the shift I made and looking at some explicit instruction with some vocabulary, that it's not on the whim, that it's not when it just comes up when it comes up, but how do I be intentional? How do I be intentional with building vocabulary and working on the language comprehension strands? And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And so one of the things I first did, at the start of this year, was say, you know what? We're word collectors. We're word collectors. This is the bulletin board outside my room. And so again, it's with Peter's work. And so, with the children's book, and that's how we talked about it. We said, we're word collectors, and we started with reading a book because a good mentor text goes a long way. And so the thing with this was, it's one thing to find the words, but then we took it a step further. It's another to understand the words and understand the words in the context that you received it. And then the next part is this: they, during writing time, can take a word and transfer that word into their writing. And so they understand a word and that they've read. We talk about what it means. We talk about it in the context, in different contexts. And then if they want, they can take that word, because again, and I'll show you later that, how do the words could get up, but how do they get down? Because then we run out of room. And so the thing is, they come down when they want to utilize them in their writing. And so then that's another point for me to talk about context. Do they understand the word? Do they understand the word as they wrote it in their journals? And the thing is it might be somebody else's word they chose. They don't have to pick up the word that they chose. It might have been someone else's word from someone else's book. And they're like, you know what? I want to use that today in my writing, and let me see if I can. Well, I better understand the word. I better know the word. But it may not even be in the same context that it was in the book. And so that's why it's important with some of this stuff, and we'll talk about for it. The other one that I do that we talk about is The Boy Who Loved Words. And again, another book with it too. And anywhere they go, finding all these neat little words that they have for that, and just collecting them of things. And what does morsel mean? And what does luscious mean? And all these words that they have. And again, so finding, how do we find those words? How do we find those words? And because again, even if we're reading them and choice of words from authors to make, something explicit or to turn something from a lengthy sentence using only a couple juicy words, is important. And so again, how do we then transfer that to writing as we use some of these words and understand them? So again, these two books that I start with to say, you know what, we're going to be explicit. We're going to look for words. We're going to understand words, and then we're going to transfer those words to our writing. And we're not done with that yet. And so we know that there's those three tiers of words. We know that tier one is those everyday ones, that everyday speech, where tier three is those domain specific. And I always think, so when we're talking about it, they're going to understand what a vertices is in mathematics. They're going to understand the commutative property. Those are tier three words. Those are domain specific. And so we really want tier two words. What are those high frequency words that are found in many content areas? And so a lot of the things that I might talk about today, that I've integrated and utilized, again, comes from this fantastic book. And so you'll be able to kind of see how I bring some of that in. And so the first part is, when I'm looking at vocabulary and being explicit with it, is I need to identify tier two words, right? And so in the book, they talk about kind of three things with that. So that importance and that utility, that it appears cross domain. So a technique that I have in a badminton serve might be different than the technique that the city uses to pick up trash. That might be different to a technique in another domain. And so what are those words that use across certain domains? What are those ones that again, it's that precision? And so I talk about those juicy words, because we could say, enough of something, but that juicy word, is it sufficient? Is it sufficient? Do we have enough? And so as we talk about these juicy words, we talk about what that word might mean. So when someone finds luscious, what does luscious mean? Well, let's break it down. This is what it means. So now when you're going to use it, or when you see it, you've got the meaning, and let's provide precision to what we're reading. And then that instructional potential, the one that has that variety. Brush. Is it a brush that I'm using? Am I brushing off somebody? Am I brushing by something? And so what are those things that have variety in the context and uses? And so I always, now I'm on the hunt. Where are those tier 2 words in my mentor text that I use? And where are those tier 2 words that might be in my read alouds that I can draw out, that then we can really focus on and build that vocabulary with our students? And so this is some of the thing with it, and I have an 8, but again, when we find it, we read the story. I've already found the word. I already know what word I want. And so can we contextualize it in the story? Children say it. Again, friendly definition. What might it mean? This is what it might mean, so that students can understand it. But then also too, give examples that are not in the text. And so how do we provide examples outside of that? Because again, the text might not be relevant to everyone. And so how can we make it relevant to different things? And obviously, knowing your students the best, obviously you can contextualize and provide different context for those words. And then we engage in some of those activities, and I'll show some of those later on here. And then have children say the word. And I have a number 8. My number 8 is, it goes on the board. That word goes on the board of the word collector. Because we've already done the work, let's put it on. And so sometimes it's my words that I found, sometimes it's student words. And so when we think about it and say, as they're reading, and we're doing readers, workshop, and they're reading, and they say, I think I've got a word. Perfect. So when we come time to reflect, and we bring everything in, and we've got this word, and we put it on the card, and now let's talk about it. Where does it appear in the story? What are different contexts that it appears in? Then children are gaining that vocabulary as I find words, but also as they find words in their books. And sometimes I have to tell them, this is a great word, just not juicy enough in terms of, there's that vocabulary that's already tier 1, because we can have lots of those tier 1 words on our bulletin board out front. And that's not what we want. And so what are those tier 2 words, and sometimes tier 3 words that we have that we can do it? And so an example I have here, and so would be, and they say it in the book, and so I have one too here from the class, and so Dr. DeSoto, and so again, we've opened up to a page, and if I'm looking at it and saying, okay, I really want to talk about delicate, that's the word I really want to talk about. And so as I read this story, and we get to this part, and Dr. DeSoto has got gloves on, and his fingers are so delicate, and his drill is dainty that they could hardly feel the pain. It's like, okay, well, let's talk about delicate now. We've picked the word. We've got it. And so then now, as we do that, then we start to think, okay, what does delicate mean? Okay, we've got this little mouse here, and he's in there, and delicate, and is being very careful, and being, be very cautious with this stuff. But then, and obviously have the child say the word, but then other context, that we want, that this vase is very delicate because it might break. Right. And so we have to handle this. It's very delicate, where, again, same thing, another context where you might say, okay, wait a minute here. This situation is very delicate, that we have to handle it. There's lots of moving parts. There's lots of things. And so you might use that in different contexts. And then we engage with them in activities with it, and have them say, and add it to the word collector wall. And so here we are. We've got words added to the wall. And so, we think about some of the ones, and there's a big, long, pink one in there that they've talked about, and they found it's in a nonfiction book. It's one of the longest words in the English language. And it's like, yeah, let's do this one. It's like, perfect. We've got these things. And so then now can they take them down as we go for that? And so again, we're always word collectors, and this stays up from the start of the year, and just stuff goes up, goes down, goes up, goes down as we talk about these things. And so what are the activities that we do? And so some of the activities that they talk about and that I've incorporated come from the book. And so it's questions, reasons, examples. So why do we need to be delicate with things? And so why do we need to handle delicate things with care? So we pose the question, Oh yeah, because it's breakable, because we need to make sure that, that we're careful, that there's stuff happening that. And so if we're looking at that and questioning why we might need to handle delicate things with care, or whatever word you're using, then students can obviously deepen their understanding about that word. And so making choices. If I say an example and something's delicate, I need you to say delicate. So then you say, a glass vase, and the kids will say delicate, and I'll say, all right. And then you say an old, you might say a log, and nope, not saying anything, because a log isn't delicate. And so you provide examples, and do they listen to that example, go, okay, yeah, no, that's delicate, oh, maybe that's not delicate. And then I like to put stuff in, because I say a rock, and now people go, could be delicate. And now you have that conversation. Well, why could it be delicate? Well, is it a rock? Is it amethyst? Is it, is it granite? Is it something that you found? Is it something that means something to you? Is that why it might be delicate versus just a rock that you pick up on the street? Or a large rock that maybe not delicate. And so again, you're like, ooh, even though, and so you have those deep and rich conversations just about making choices. Is it delicate? Is it not delicate? And I purposefully always throw in some examples that could be either or, just so I get those kids deciding, well, if it's delicate to you, it might not be delicate to others. And again, depends on context, and depends on your background knowledge of what you're thinking about when I say rocks, or when I say certain things. And make choices is, do you have different words in there? So would you prefer to nudge a dangerous animal or carry something delicate? And now it's like, okay, well, what does dangerous mean? Ooh, okay, what does delicate mean? Okay, so now which one do I want? Carry something delicate or nudge some? Ooh, okay. And so now you're having to make choices and reason between some of these words that you might find, or that you might have used, or two students bring words up that day. If two students bring up words that day, then sometimes we say, let's make choices between these. What would you rather do? What would you rather do? And sometimes then, do they use all the words? And do they relate them to one another? And do they have them writing them out in a sentence? Or do children come up with examples with those new words that they just had found in the books, or that we had found in our mentor text or in our read aloud? And so again, being purposeful when I select the words from mentor text or from the read aloud, and being purposeful in the selection that I choose from students. Because, again, there still has to be purpose to it. It can't just be, let's pick a word and let's do it. There has to be that purpose. Is it a tier 2? If it's a tier 1, maybe we just put it up and not talk about it. Is it a tier 3? Fine. Can we talk about it in the context of tier 3 of the domain? If it's a math word, are we talking about it math? If it's a science word, are we breaking it down into science? And so where does that come in as we think about these words? And then some follow-up activities, because that's just not enough. And so the next day, do you come in and do you say, okay, does delicate mean small and easily broken, or big and strong? And is that the attendance that day? Oh, delicate. And if you've got your attendance things and they're magnets, and you answer a question, these are some of the things: delicate, strong, and they put it beside. And is that how the way that you do attendance with it? And do you give them situations and examples? And so if someone buys a lacy dress, could you say it's delicate? And what else might you talk about something being delicate? And so now, can they transfer that to you giving an example, but then also thinking about a situation that something delicate might be used something else? And then fill in the missing word. And so a baby's tiny fingers are blank. A large, tiger is blank. And so are they putting dangerous in the tiger? Are they putting baby's fingers are delicate? Or are they putting that as dainty? What are those things that they can fill in the blank? So not only are they seeing the sentence, are they making meaning of the sentence, but seeing what word fits to make meaning of that sentence. And are they understanding it also as they build that vocabulary? And so again, thinking about that as they put words in, as they read and build that language comprehension strands, that's exactly what they're doing. They're making meaning of those words. Do they understand that word that might be at the end of the sentence? Do they understand how those words before it, help out the context? Or what are some of those clues for it? And so all those skills in that language comprehension come out in these activities when, as again, you're building that breadth and depth of knowledge of vocabulary with the student. And so for this, do you follow up with word associations? I'm going to say a word. What does it make you think of this? And so, what if I were to say, again, breakable, and I would say, of the 3 words that we learned yesterday or this week, which word would you choose? Like which word of those, which words that we learned would go to that would say easily breakable? And then again, finish the sentence. So we're bringing that into writing, and that's how I transfer that. And if you're going to take something off of the word collector wall, you're already doing a finish the sentence, and you're actually starting the sentence. You're just using it. And so that's how I integrate it with let's take it down, as if we're doing finish the sentence, but now you have to create the whole sentence. And are you using that in your writing? And where can you use it in the writing? And then so sometimes then you read off sentences. Does it make sense? The large tree trunk is delicate. May not make sense versus, having that daintiness or that, breakable thing or something like that you would say that would go, yeah, that is delicate. But a large tree trunk, maybe not delicate. And then again, that final review is what word means small and easily broken? Like, do they know what that means? Oh yeah, that was delicate. It's like, okay, perfect. Like, we need to have some review that do they understand what that word means? And if they're saying, well, I can't remember what that word means, then obviously that tells us, that we need to do a little bit more work on the vocabulary with using that certain word with that student so that they understand it. And so as I think about some of those things, and we go back to, the language comprehension skills and looking at some of the stuff, that's where I bring in a lot of mentor texts to talk about things. And I'm sure many of you are familiar that I talk about 20 odd ducks. And again, that talks about punctuation marks, where punctuation marks count. And so again, as they're reading, do they understand what they're reading? Are they looking at the punctuation? Are they looking at the syntax and the semantics of things as they understand what they're reading? Same thing here. The girls like spaghetti. Why we can't manage without apostrophes. And so again, an example here is like, we see the boys bat. Do we see the boys bat that belongs to them, that boy? Or do we see the boys bat with 3 of the boys holding the bat? Like, those 3 things are different where the apostrophe is. And so again, where do kids see that so that they're understanding what they're reading? Because again, it's not just the words, it's not decoding what they're doing, but are they seeing the structure? Are they seeing the language structure in these things? And so, again, the next example, we're here to help you versus we're here to help you. There's different things with it. And so this is a great book with that, and kids love reading it on their own. But this, again, a mentor text with that. And we all know, because there's memes and everything out there about it, but eats, shoots, and leaves, where do commas exist, right? Like, we need to have commas in certain areas, or is grandma getting eaten? Or is that who we're having for supper, right? And so again, all these different things that we can tie in to these mentor texts for it. And so as we build vocabulary, a lot of work too is certain things, as we think about synonyms and we think about homophones. And so again, I bring in dear, right? Because even though you might read it properly, do you understand what the dear is, right? Do you understand that? Well, I had another one here. I'll see if I can find it too. And so those are some of the things that I bring in with that. Another book, if you haven't, is The Right Word, that juicy right word. And so this boy begins to make lists of words that they find. And he finds Latin words and the English word, and what are the meanings, and is there a cross between the two? And so he starts when he's 8 to write his own book, but instead of writing stories, he writes lists. And he just needs to find the right word. And so they talk about some of these things with that. And so are there words that you can use that convey meaning that are a bit more powerful? And that goes back to understanding what luscious might mean and things like that. And then again, too, I always look at a child of books. And as this little girl goes on the adventure through the words and the story, and a sea of words arrive at the house. So she goes on an adventure because the words can take them on the adventure. And obviously, which is important for kids, is we want them to love reading and understand what they're reading and make meaning of the reading, but by applying these skills that we have in the language comprehension strand, and tying that into the comprehension strategies to understand what we're reading. And so the other thing too is, with that, depending on it, sometimes this is more small groupish that I would do, depending on the words that I'm looking at, but doing that structured word inquiry and understanding some roots and some suffixes and prefixes and what does that mean. And so this is one that would have the word matrix, and understanding, are there things that we can do with it? And there's a great site that we can do too, that it's a mini matrix maker. And so you can make your own, depending on it. Like, you might not want all of the prefixes and suffixes with certain things. And so this is a free site for the with this from Neil out of the UK. And so you can make your own matrix, and it pops up like this as you go. And so again, if I just want to focus on certain ones, I can quickly make one and generate it for what I need in the classroom, for what I need for that day, as we're looking at that inquiry. The other ones that I look at too, that I go to, that have come out too, is the morpheme magic, as we talk about some of the stuff with prefixes and root words and different things like that. And so, pulling out some of the stuff from Deb's work with it, I tie that in as well. And the other piece to it is, and for those who haven't seen this book, and those who have watched The Right to Read, you would notice that when the teacher was on the carpet cutting, she was cutting the resource from this. And so this is the book about reading differentiation, and it has certain things in there, and word lists and sentences and different things like that. And so again, from this book, I've created these pouches. So this is people working on long vowels. These are students working on are controlled. And so in this pouch, I've cut out what the teacher was cutting out and made them into little flippables. And so when the students come to me, they read these words, and they read them to me, and I read them to them or with them. They read the sentence. They read the sentence to themselves. They read the sentence to a partner. They read the sentence to me. And that's practicing fluency with some of these words in there. And you'd be surprised. I still had a boy today who read the word yield. Yield was one of the words in the long vowels. And he turns to me and says, "What does that mean?" Perfect. Here's what this means. Let's talk about this. The great thing was, yield was also in the sentence, that we had to yield and look to make sure it was safe to cross. And so again, that transfer with that. But how many times people would read something and go, "What does that mean?" Because they're decoding well. But again, as we do this, some of this stuff is understanding with that. And so the way that I do this is I keep a list of my students, and I just check mark the ones that they've done, because if they're not there that day and I pull them and they quickly do it, that I just keep track on a sheet, and the sheet goes into the pouch. And so even if a sub's not there, or if a sub is there, they know that they pull this out, they pull the list, they do the next one, they bring the students back, and I have them all in these things here ready to go, cut out and binded with that, which again is from this book. And as you do some of these activities, some of the activities in the back are multisyllabic, which also then goes to, they start talking about prefixes and suffixes and what do they mean. And so what are some words that have un in it, and what does un mean? And they have a list of them, and they read those words, and then they have to spell those words. And so that's going later on to those students who are in that multisyllabic. And so these are some of the key things that I integrate into the classroom as I focused my work on being explicit in my vocabulary instruction, being robust versus being incidental, being where you'll get it when you get it, or I have a conversation with one student, but I don't teach everyone about it. And so I was missing that language comprehension strand. But now I see it ties into all those reading comprehension strategies. And I thought, why wasn't I doing this sooner? Why was I spending a month on visualizing when really the language comprehension skills were coming into all the comprehension strategies? And so that was just mind blowing to me, and a change of practice, which has obviously been fantastic to see the growth and skills in the students, but comprehension hasn't lacked. So the fact that I haven't spent that much time on some of those comprehension strategies that I did in the past, they're doing much better in their comprehension because of the skills of understanding that language and understanding the structures and understanding the vocabulary. And so it kind of was a shift for me, do less of that and do more of this because they'll get better at that. Was great to see. And so that was a little glimpse into my 2-3 classroom with that. And so I look at the time, 8:02, we're 2 minutes over. I want to thank you for joining us this evening. I know our next session is on April 3rd, that we talk about parts 4 and 5. Thank you so much. I'm going to leave this open. I'm not sure if Andrea wants to pop on and has anything to say as well.
No, Chad, I wish I was a student in your classroom because I'm like, yay, I can do it. So I want to thank you for leading this with us today. And I hope as classroom teachers, you have some great new ideas. And I think we all will want to have book lists coming from you when you talk about those different mentor texts. I was trying to write them down or capture them, but I mean, we all love a great book that can do a lot of teaching, but also that kids are going to enjoy. So I do want to just thank everybody for joining us, and I really look forward to seeing you again on April 3rd.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.